This Late Night Linux Family podcast is made possible by our patrons. Go to latenightlinux.com/support for details of how you can join them. Support us on Patreon for access to ad-free episodes and early releases. That's latenightlinux.com/support.
Hybrid Cloud Show, episode 35. I'm Aaron.
I'm Gary.
I'm Sean.
And I'm Shane.
Welcome to the show about public cloud, private cloud, and everything in between. Our views here are ours and not those of our employers. So Harold asked, when it comes to picking which public cloud provider is best for me and my business, the answer is always, it depends. And my question is, it depends on what? And I thought this would be an interesting framing for us to have a more general conversation around the things that people should think about when they're choosing cloud providers and why it does, in fact, depend.
Who's got the biggest free usage tier as a startup that ends up getting your vendor locked in because you build your whole business around their sweet deals?
Hang on, that means everyone would build on Oracle Cloud if that were the case, Shane.
That's true, actually. And I've been at startups where the Azure free tier benefit was like 10 times what Amazon was providing, and I still own Amazon, so I'm debating my wise initial words.
Okay, well, that's a good starting point. So you're talking about having a much more generous offer from Azure, and you went with AWS anyway. Why would you do that?
So AWS offered a quite reasonable amount of free credits as well, and it was what I calculated at the time under our needs. So for free credits, particularly if you're a startup and you're in an accelerator program or something, you'll get like a fixed amount each month or a fixed amount for 12 months you've got to spend. And so whilst AWS gave a certain amount and Azure offered, 10x that amount, I knew we were very unlikely to go over what AWS was offering. And so it became then which is a preference really. And AWS just happened to be what we're familiar with. And so I just opted for that. However, I also do have a bias against Azure because it's a Microsoft product and because I've used it in anger in the past and just did not find it particularly intuitive. But I suspect in the years since, it's probably caught up with AWS, particularly with IAC. I didn't like using CloudFormation, but it felt better than what Azure was offering at the time.
So I guess there's really two reasons there, right? There is familiarity with it and ability to employ people with the relevant skill set in order to orchestrate workloads on that cloud. I think that is probably quite a big one for most people. I think in certain areas there are definitely people with more AWS skills versus Azure skills versus GCP skills. And I suppose that really depends on what kind of on-premises workloads were those people administering. There's a lot of plug-in familiarity with PowerShell and things if you're orchestrating workloads on Azure that just works. And if you've been living in that world and understand the syntax of PowerShell and its CMDlets and all that kind of stuff, I think Azure is pretty easy to get to grips with. AWS is probably a little bit more easy if you're kind of Linux sysadmin type, and there's lots of little services that do the things that they do pretty well, but you then have to bolt them together. And that's probably quite a different skill set to the much more integrated approach that Azure has.
I mean, to be fair, the Azure approach does have both the PowerShell and the AZ-CLI, which is more Linuxy in style than the PowerShell. But yeah, I think you're right that if you're in that PowerShell world, then Azure's going to feel a little nicer with that PowerShell kind of interface. It sounds like there's also the implicit piece there around the free credits, right? So it sounds as though in both cases you were looking at the amount of free credits you were being offered, and it was because they were effectively the same from your perspective that you were able to choose based on a preference.
Yeah, it would have been a harder decision if I knew we would burn through the AWS credits quite quickly. So I might look to use Azure, or I might even offload certain expensive workloads to Azure and minimize the amount I need to deal with it if it's something unfamiliar, chop and change it a bit. But as I say, we were well under the AWS's offer, so it was fine. Sounds like you both have some experience in Azure. Are you very tied into the Microsoft ecosystem if you want to work in Azure? Like you've talked about PowerShell, like there's no Bash equivalent or knock up a couple of scripts around that CLI you're talking about, Aaron. I ask just because, again, I'm not in the Microsoft ecosystem, so that would be friction for me.
I think it's better than it used to be. when things were fairly early days and Azure was in its infancy, I guess, and almost felt like a bolt-on to Office 365 and some of those other services, it did feel quite foreign for me as more of a Linuxy type person to administer. But I think as Microsoft have started targeting a lot more of the cloud native and serverless workloads, and it's not just the place you run .NET applications in the cloud like it maybe was 10 years ago, I think that's gotten better. I mean, Aaron mentioned the AZ CLI that Azure now has. When I first started using Azure, that didn't exist, and you were using the Azure PowerShell stuff, which was painful, to say the least. They've put a lot of equivalencies in there with the other cloud providers now, like Cloud Shell, for example, is now just a thing that you get in the Azure console. I know the UI has been cleaned up a lot. Like I remember when I first started using Azure, they had this concept of blades in the UI, where you would click on something and then you would get another blade that came out, and then it was like these sub tabs effectively of stuff in Azure. And I think a lot of that stuff has been cleaned up now. So it is a lot more user friendly and a lot more approachable for non-Windows sysadmins / non.NET developers than perhaps it once was. I mean, I'm talking that there were certain points where VNet integration didn't exist for certain services in Azure, like Azure Container Service back in the early days. You couldn't tie a running container in their equivalent of ECS back to a VNet, which meant that you couldn't access resources privately or back into your on-prem network, which was super painful when I was trying to do that.
Yeah, my experience recently has been that nearly everything is supported in the AZ CLI, and the approach of the AZ CLI is much more Linuxy. Like the expectation is you are doing things like bash scripts rather than building your PowerShell commandlets or whatever they are. And that's handy for me because I do not get along with PowerShell. I mean, I haven't exercised the whole thing by any stretch, and there's a whole areas I'm sure I've never touched. But I believe the general approach is that now they have, I think it's called the Azure Resource Monitor. There's some piece that sits in the middle, and then there's a sort of general approach that they implement things in a way that plugs into that, and then you have the CLI, the PowerShell, and the API all sort of connect back through that same sort of general idea of an interface in the middle. So I think there is a general approach that they're trying to make sure that things are equivalent between the different ways of talking to Azure, but I'm sure that there are gaps. I remember there was one I came across a while back where I was looking at the ways of doing in-guest policy on instances, and the general idea was that you either used, I think it was PowerShell desired state config or something, or you could use chef inspec for Linux machines. And so, there was an expectation of PowerShell to do some particular bits of that, which was a bit painful. But with that exception, most things don't have any kind of PowerShell dependency that I've come across.
Yeah, that sounds like it's changed quite a bit since I was last using Azure in production then, because there was definitely this hard push towards PowerShell desired state for machine config, for example, when I was last using it, which was super painful to have to go and learn PowerShell DSC. But the flip side of that is that it was all integrated in the same way that user data is integrated in AWS. And you could literally create a machine, pass in your .ps1 file with your DSC object in when you were spinning up a Windows machine, and it would create the instance, run the PowerShell desired state, and then it would only complete your ARM template deployment once the desired state had spat back that it was successful code or whatever. So yeah, the integration was always quite nice, but only if you stayed kind of within that walled garden of the .NET, Windows, Microsoft stuff. So it doesn't surprise me that that's changed, because clearly to get wider adoption that was needed.
And I think that talks to a broader piece there around integration with the tooling that you use. So, I mean, it seems obvious because a lot of the big clouds have got integration with a lot of the big things. But if you're using something a bit more niche than just Terraform or whatever, or you're using a cloud that is more niche than the major clouds, then I suppose there's a question around cloud choice that is to do with what your tools plug into as well, because obviously choosing a cloud that doesn't have good first-class support and whatever you're using for your tooling is a bad choice.
Yeah, I mean, we've spoken before about some of the smaller, particularly European clouds, right, that don't have stellar support for things like Terraform for every service. And yes, in the public clouds, a lot of those are community supported, but the flip side of that is that some of those community members actually work for the companies anyway. They're just doing it in their spare time. So I think that would be a really important one for me, right? If I was already a shop that was heavily invested in the HashiCorp suite, for example, then I would probably want something that supported Terraform.
I have so many comments. You guys have switched between Azure and Azure like 30 times. I can't tell which it is. Yeah. It's hysterical to me.
It's Azure, and Americans say it wrong and poison us.
Bro, you were the one who was saying Azure just 2 seconds ago.
Yeah, I know. It's because you've all poisoned my brain.
I think we've already fallen into a fatal mistake that many companies make, which is we went straight to discussing the big 3 public clouds instead of really talking about when to consider any of the smaller clouds. And maybe we should start talking about maybe starting at one of the smaller clouds and then really investigating when you need to go to one of the bigger clouds. Do you think that's a sane approach, or does it just make sense to jump right into the public clouds?
I think it depends on how you're building the application, right? If you're intending on just going containers and you can deploy and run those wherever you want to, then I have seen companies successfully start out on something like DigitalOcean, get their company to a point where it's built up, and then move over to AWS once they're established enough as a startup to get an account manager in the AWS startups team and get some free credits thrown at them, and then migrate across to Fargate or something using the existing containers they've already built. I guess my issue with that approach has always been that you effectively end up building up technical debt from day one, because you know you're probably never going to expand to even thousands of users potentially on one of the smaller clouds, because there's a lot of manual effort and orchestration for the reasons we already mentioned about tooling on those smaller clouds. So you effectively end up building something as a POC on a few VMs and then having to deal with unpicking that to move to one of the larger clouds if you want to at some point in the future. I guess the other part of that is I mentioned funding, and DigitalOcean don't give out a crap ton of startup credits in the same way that Google or Microsoft would to a small business, right?
Is that what you had in mind, Sean, when you asked that question? Because when you first posed it, I was considering it, and I was wondering why I would go to a smaller cloud provider at all. Wouldn't it be easier to go to bigger clouds? But were you thinking because a DigitalOcean will hand you a simpler abstraction layer to like get something up and running, and that's a fine start? Or did you have other like pricing or something in mind as to why you'd go to a smaller cloud first?
Not necessarily. I was thinking more along the lines of maybe privacy or billing, right? Accounting is definitely one of them. It does sound like the big 3 public clouds have kind of a mind share and a market share in terms of the whole entire scale of industry, whether you're a small business, medium business, or giant enterprise, with all the free credits they can afford to give because they operate at that hyper scale, right? That maybe DigitalOcean or Linode can't really compete with. But I think Gary also hit on something that I was thinking about, which is it almost seems inevitable, right? Because if you're starting out and you're building these applications, sure, you might start in DigitalOcean, but you're eventually planning, at least, to eventually scale out to beyond maybe what DigitalOcean can provide. And so at that point, why even investigate a smaller cloud when the big 3 are inevitable?
Something in me about fighting the man just rings wrong. Like, support your local cloud provider. I don't know.
Gary, I just want to push back, maybe not push back, but at least dig in a little to that question. So you were talking about effectively the inevitability of having to move because of, limitations in the tooling or whatever. Then we started talking about, say, Linode, but we've already said that actually, a provider at the scale of someone like Linode actually has a lot of things like a Kubernetes engine and, load balancers and all of those sorts of things. What are the kind of limitations that you're thinking of? And is that something that you would hit at a medium scale of a business or a big scale of business? What are the sort of things you had in mind?
So I think some of the things I had in mind were actually around finding people who are familiar enough to work with those clouds, to build in them at scale. That is a really niche skill set. For example, it's probably much easier to find someone who can scale to a medium-sized set of infrastructure on one of the big cloud providers than they could on Linode. Support is going to be significantly harder to come by, both from the vendor and from other third-party tooling on those other clouds. Say, if you were plugging in a third-party security provider platform or wanting to have a SIEM or something that integrates nicely with those clouds, that doesn't necessarily happen as easily with some of the smaller cloud providers. I think there are a whole bunch of things you start running into at that scale that just make it really difficult. I mean, compliance is another one, right? If you are in fintech or gambling or banking or whatever it might be, a lot of the big clouds have already done some of the work for you in terms of having their infrastructure certified for PCI or HIPAA or whatever it might be in a way that perhaps a smaller provider may not have done. There are frameworks for how you build secure, scalable, resilient applications in the larger clouds that maybe aren't quite as prevalent in some of the smaller clouds. So I think you almost end up with this death by 1,000 cuts of the industry recognizes those big clouds. It recognizes what they do well. They understand where the lines of responsibility are between the end user / consumer and the cloud provider to provide certain bits of the stack. And I feel like you end up having to do a lot of that work yourself if you stick with one of the smaller providers for longer.
Gary's absolutely right. If you're in a special market that, like gambling or PCI or HIPAA, maybe not PCI, but at least HIPAA, you do need special infrastructure, and the big three already have that done for you. So using them makes a lot of sense in that case. I do want to challenge, though, because some of the smaller providers for things like support we mentioned, they have, sub 30-minute contracts that you can purchase, which feel the same, at least line by line, if looking at their page, to something like AWS. And the Terraform providers, they're good. I haven't used really Terraform enough to get into a place where I couldn't do something in the node that I could do in like GCP. But I'm sure there are limitations. But I mean, if you're getting that niche, then yeah, maybe you shouldn't be on a smaller cloud if you have such a special need.
Well, I don't even think you have to get very far down the special need piece, right? If you want a managed Redis, for example, that doesn't exist in some of the smaller clouds. If you're using a database engine that isn't Postgres or MySQL, that doesn't exist in the smaller clouds. So I think you do run into those limitations much quicker than you think, or you end up, kind of like I said, bearing the burden of running some of those things. Like, sure, I could run a Redis container on Kubernetes in Linode, and that's probably fine. But do I want to have to do that? Is that heavy lifting that I want my infrastructure team to have to do that perhaps they wouldn't have to do quite so much of if the day-to-day operation of that were outsourced to someone else? And I can't tell you the answer, right? Because it entirely depends on where your organization wants to put its resources. But I think that is something to consider, is the line moves, right, as to what you are managing versus what the cloud provider can manage for you as you move between these different clouds.
I do sometimes wonder if we're guilty of looking at this from the perspective of people who are dealing with companies at massive scale or doing things properly, in quotes, where you've got big platform engineering teams. And, there's these things that we talk about in terms of the way you architect applications or how you deploy things. And then I come across so many companies where I talk to them and it's just, these rickety piles of things that really are just VMs sitting, and they were once upon a time in a cabinet in a corner of the office, and now they're in a cabinet in a corner of a public cloud, and that could be anyone's public cloud just as easily. I'm just wondering if there's a sort of bias here that reveals a difference in perspective.
It's highly possible, like as we were talking about, how having to build up technical debt in DigitalOcean, maybe a single shell script that vends a bunch of stuff is actually quite an elegant thing to have to eventually migrate off to something far more complicated, rather than, right, we in 2 years' time when we're mega successful, we're going to go to Azure and think about all their IAM policies and then learn something that means Azure is actually a pain and doesn't work for us in 2 years' time when we scale in some weird and wonderful way that we didn't predict. And then it's actually a bigger headache than the single shell script you might have had on DigitalOcean.
Yeah, I mean, what we don't know here is the scale of business that is looking at this decision, right? The answer is going to be very different if you're an established business with 800 employees that's already using Office 365 or whatever, than it is to your 5-person startup that's looking to build the next cool credit referencing application or whatever else it is, right? That's a very different set of skills, requirements, people than the former. So it is really difficult to answer what it depends on without having all of the context and all of the information to consider.
Did you say the next cool credit referencing application?
Oh, there are a bunch of those that come out. Like, if you search for those on the Play Store, there are hundreds of connect us with open banking to your bank account and we'll tell you where you can save money or give you your list of recurring bills and stuff. Like, there's literally hundreds of those. And for a while, that was like the hot new business to start as a fintech, was like we'll manage your money for you by pulling in your open banking data.
I think we brought up a good point that we're maybe looking at this from a bigger perspective than some of our listeners. I'd like to ask them, have you guys run into any limitations using any small cloud providers or even their Terraform providers or stuff like that? Please let us know. show@hybridcloudshow.com.
And I do have to, as a counterpoint, say I've set up companies on DigitalOcean with some shell scripts, and they aren't hyperscale, sexy credit reference startups, and they're perfectly fine. It works great.
Yeah, and I mean, to play devil's advocate slightly, I think if it were me, I also probably wouldn't be jumping to AWS or Azure or GCP if I were starting a business. I'd want to scaffold this stuff on a smaller cloud provider, keep the footprint fairly small and easy to manage, just a couple of Linux boxes, load balancer in front of them, run some containers, be fine. But I'm also not a developer just trying to write some code and deploy it. Like, I'm from an infrastructure background and therefore I'm able to do that. There are a whole bunch of people who have never even touched a Linux CLI and are trying to build the next cool hot startup. And perhaps those aren't the target audience for the smaller clouds either. I think we're also looking at this from not only a business point of view, but from a point of view of people who have worked in the sysadmin, DevOps, platform engineering space, and are all seasoned Linux users. That is very different from 20-year-old just finishing university thinking that they're going to make millions with their new app in the App Store, right?
So here's a question. There's a lot of talk about repatriation of cloud workloads back into data centers as big businesses realize that cloud is a bit more expensive than they thought, or whatever other reasons. If you are having to repatriate your workloads back in the data center, and therefore you're having to choose technologies that you can get up and running in your data center, does that then mean that you're having to use technologies that would work just as well in a smaller cloud provider as they would in the big clouds, because you can't rely on those cloud-specific things in the same way anyway?
Well, you're essentially going back to the paradigm of running stuff on VMs, right? So therefore, yeah, it could work just as well in a smaller cloud provider than it could in one of the larger cloud providers or on-prem.
If you try to do this, I challenge you not to get credits from your cloud provider, because that is a push. And as soon as they see that, they just throw credits your way because they're just trying to find that number. They're just trying to find the number of break even where it makes sense to keep your workloads in their cloud versus move it to a data center, to a smaller cloud, wherever it is. And they'll throw money at the issue to keep you there.
Well, they also do that to encourage you to move between clouds, right? I've seen plenty of cases where Microsoft have thrown money at people to say, hey, we'll give you free engineering effort to try and get your application running on Azure. Well, that's great, but all of my team are skilled up on running the application in VMware. So I'm not that interested in you moving it to some cloud native thing that they then can't manage and end up paying professional services for the next 10 years.
Totally true. It might not be even VMs, it might just be containers. So maybe you say, Kubernetes is expensive in the cloud, we can do it native, right? And then you have some sort of VPN that connects you to the rest of that. But at least your Kubernetes workloads can run on-prem, starting off small with what you can afford to do where it makes sense. And that's just all business procedures. That's just a cost-benefit analysis for them.
Well, it's still VMs at that point, though, right? Like, you've still got to build Kubernetes on top of something. So you still end up with that paradigm, whatever way you look at it.
Kubernetes on bare metal, fight me.
Sure, but then you still have to have that skill set. So either way, you don't win, right? It's just an orchestration engine, no matter if it's in DO or AWS or on-prem.
Fair enough.
With the exception of those hyper-specific kind of companies that have algorithmic moving of workloads between clouds, hitting spot instances, those really high, like those sorts of end of the spectrum. Outside of that space, have you seen customers who are putting bits of their workloads in different clouds to take advantage of, for example, differential pricing of, machines with GPUs or instances that are ARM-based or instances, being cheaper with lots of RAM on this cloud or anything like that?
I have seen that, but what I've seen more is companies choosing parts of the cloud stack which are better or fit their workflow better. So, for example, I've seen a lot of customers who deploy their workloads in AWS or GCP, but they really like Azure Log Analytics. So they ship all of their logs and metrics and traces off to Azure in a storage account and use Azure Log Analytics for those. And that might be because they've got their central monitoring platform or their security team use Azure or whatever it might be. So I've seen a lot of the using the best tool for the job approach to hybrid cloud. I've not seen so much people saying, well, it's 2 cents an hour cheaper to run a machine with a GPU in GCP than it is in Oracle Cloud, so I'm going to run it in GCP. That tends to not happen as much, I guess. And ultimately, those big workloads, they end up sitting where the data sits, I suppose. So if your data is in one of the big clouds, your workloads that process that data are likely also in that cloud. And that's the same with the AI stuff that's coming down the pipe, right? I think that's why there has been such a big fight over the last few years for different cloud providers to win the database and data storage race.
Yeah.
Is because they charge you a shit ton of money to have that data move out of their cloud in egress costs. So if they can win the data, then they can win the processing of that data, and that's actually where the profit is.
And that's why AWS launched S3 vectors.
And Aurora and a bunch of other stuff, right? If you can basically scale Postgres better than any other cloud can in the world, because you've built your own Postgres-compatible engine and all of the storage is sharded in a way that only you understand, and you can scale to hundreds of terabytes in a single table, then people are going to process that data on your cloud too.
Yeah, the decision to move off Aurora when you're dependent on it is an expensive one.
Yeah, because there is nothing else that operates at that scale. I mean, people are now going to write in and tell me that there probably is something, but Aurora is the thing you go to, right?
There are other competitors that are like Alloy. It's the same exact thing. You're trading one thing for another.
I like that we all talk about this like these decisions aren't made at 2 a.m. in a karaoke bar with a drunk economic buyer.
On that positive note, it's probably time for us to wrap things up. So if you have any questions or feedback, please do send it in to show@hybridcloudshow.com. A quick thank you to our existing PayPal supporters and patrons, and we are going to be back in 2 weeks. Until then, I've been Aaron.
I've been Gary.
I've been Sean.
And I've been Shane.
It's pronounced Azure. See you later.